So turning that. So Paul and Ryan, thank you for agreeing to join us. It was a little bit short notice because this was the day that worked, but thank you for being here. I want to give some context. I tried to do so in my email, and I don't want the context that you perceive to keep you from saying anything that might be in your mind. But Paul, you've joined us before and you've talked about the state of weatherization and how it works. This conversation is a little bit different. And so the way I would frame it is a lot of people are looking at how houses might change and how people might make changes in their houses. And some people like Chris are doing interviews with people who are making those changes. And often what we do is we think about who is making the decision and what kind of house they live in and what they can do and what are the factors in their decision. And so the things that we are really focusing on are what we as a team have been calling the occupant and the building. But we know that there are lots of things that lead to successful change or prevent successful change, both enabling factors and preventive factors. And some of those have to do with institutions. And so I called it governance in my email. And I think we generally have this idea that there's some kind of thing out there that operates that is not the occupant and it's not the building, and it's a bunch of other stuff that we all have to deal with and navigate. And I think what we're going to try to tease out here is not what is government, but what are some of those agents? How do they differ? And so anything that you can bring forward, especially if I didn't name it, right? Things that we might not be thinking about would be useful for the team, because I think we're trying to account for things that people experience in making change that are out of their control, that they might access, but that are a big part of the landscape. Does anyone want to add to that briefly? You'll have time to ask questions after Paul and Ryan speak for a bit, but does anyone want to add to that or provide another perspective on it? So then I was just going to give you two, Paul and Ryan, a chance to say a few words in the beginning. You can share slides if you've prepared them. It is totally not necessary. And the reason we wanted the two of you is you come from very different perspectives on governance and on entities and institutions that interact with occupants of houses. And so hopefully that bouncing off each other and what people are curious about from different points of view will draw some things out.
You want to go first, since I go to this meeting every week? That way we can preference what Paul has to say first, I think.
It doesn't matter to me. I didn't know you went to this meeting every week, although I guess I should have. Okay. So one thing I did here was I just started to make a list of a lot of the different agents that I see as having influence on how people end up using energy. And a lot of it, in my mind, really comes down to access. What kinds of access to opportunities are become available to people? If there could be all kinds of great things out there, but if they're not being brought to where the people are, then it doesn't matter, and you end up being left with whatever is there. I think that's a big issue when it comes to equity, when it comes to our disadvantaged populations. That maybe this isn't housing, but I'll give an example. It's hard for people in disadvantaged communities to start to transition to electric vehicles when nobody has bothered to put charging stations there, and when even used vehicles are kind of out of reach in terms of cost. But even if you got to where the cost for the vehicle was reasonable, if you don't have charging stations there, it doesn't matter. And that's been a really big issue with trying to get electric vehicles adopted in these types of communities, because there's no place to charge them in the first place. And so you end up essentially excluding them from that transition. But so various agents that I came up with for homes, obviously governments themselves are, in terms of the decisions they make about programs, who's getting served by programs, how they're getting served by programs. It is interesting. If you look at some of what came out of the Inflation Reduction Act, there's the Homes Act that's about energy efficiency retrofits in homes. And then there's HERA, which is High Efficiency Electric Retrofit Act, I think is what it's called. And those are rebates, but they're still just rebates, and residents need to pay a fair bit. So is that a way to actually get people to change their energy use when you're still asking low-income families to pay thousands of dollars for different types of equipment? So the governments and the programs that they do, utilities are a really, really major one in terms of the programs that they offer. And again, is it something that's a rebate, or is it a grant program? Back with the governments, like the weatherization program that I've talked about before, they do everything at no cost to the resident. That is a way that you can really make change by, we're paying for it all and we're going to decide what goes in based on program rules and latest technology. Codes and standard bodies, they're the ones who say what kinds of energy use is allowable, and they will sometimes be prescriptive of the technologies that are used. So if you say you have to do it this way, or we start to ban things like incandescent lights, then it drives people to use certain things just because they're told they have to. Trade associations and contractors, they often, the contractors are going to do what they feel comfortable with. And the trade associations have a role in helping contractors become comfortable with different types of things, as well as manufacturers. So are we empowering those middle actors, that people are actually going to the homes to have a full suite of options, or are they just going to continue to do the same things they've always done, regardless of whether it's the right thing to do? So the decisions made by these trade associations and contractors about adopting and doing training on new technologies and providing educational materials that are accessible by residents to understand what it is that's being worked on. Program implementers, those are kind of tied to utilities in some ways, that utilities don't run their own programs. They hire somebody else to run their programs. And so then what do the program implementers do? Utilities are setting up some kind of big high scale rules, but what do the program implementers do? And there's actually been a thing in Illinois very recently where they're supposed to be trying to have a certain amount of the program implementation for certain programs go to minority businesses. And what they ended up doing, or at least trying to, I don't know if it's finalized yet, but there's at least an effort being made to hire a minority program implementer from another state who could then they could claim that they had done their minority hiring. And then that program implementer in the other state could just hire all the same non-minority contractors in Illinois that were always there. So you end up not empowering the communities and the different cultural groups and all of that to be able to be a part of the discussion and be able to make some of their own decisions. They're still having the decisions made for them. Then I also have unions and building managers. Those are really going to be more of an issue in multifamily, where the residents really have even less to say because they're not responsible for the building. Building managers are responsible, and they're going to be influenced a lot by like the trade associations and just, what do they have to do? Unions by what rules they have for who they let in, and their unions have a mixed history on who they let in some ways. And then what are they training? And so Yeah, I think that in those larger buildings where unions play a role and people still live, so again, largely multifamily, they will have a role in deciding what sorts of technologies are going to go in. And one of the things with unions and contracts and trade associations, they also all tend to be very active in the codes and standards making process, often trying to avoid having codes and standards advance because they don't want to have to do more than they want to. National Association of Home Builders, they tend to want business as usual. You know, they're happy to get on board with things that increase the value of the home, but if it's something that doesn't really because it's behind the wall, but is energy efficient, they'll tend to fight it. So you have those types of organizations that are in the name of supporting their members and not making them do new and different things will fight against advancement, which then means those things are not accessible to the residents. So I'll stop there. That was my list of a bunch of different agents that I think fit into this broad definition of governance that Tammy had discussed.
Thanks, Paul. That was a lot. I can't type fast enough. Ryan, do you wanna
Yeah,
follow up on that?
can I share my screen? I did make slides, or I could just put my slides in the chat.
Should be able to share. Let me know if you can't.
I'll put a link in there as well. Just am I smart enough to share? That's the question. How many of these meetings have I been to, and I can't remember how to share my. Oh, there it is, the big green button. Okay. All right. So I hang out with political scientists all the time, and so if I don't start by presenting like, hey, this is what governance is, I think they would get mad at me. So these are the definitions I use like when I teach an undergrad class on governance. This first one, that governance is concerned with creating the conditions for ordered rule and collective action, often including agents in the private and nonprofit sectors as well as within the public sector. Then I always present a second definition. So this person finds it as the ways in which organizations in the public domain work together with partners, stakeholders, citizens, and networks to influence public policy outcomes. Then we have a long discussion about what these actually mean. So this is when I would send them out to discuss for 15 minutes, decide what this actually means. Usually we come down to like, well, I would say two summary concepts, and that's that governance is both like a normative and empirical concept. So by that, I mean, it's something that when we look at the world, we see these multiple overlapping institutions and rules that are shaping public outcomes. Those can be of governments or they can be of non-government actors like Paul talked a lot about. And we also see it as a normative concept. The governance is something we see as like striving towards. When we talk about governance, we often link it to this idea of good governance, or there's something that our social system and government systems should be doing to help improve outcomes. So I think last December I had to do a little short talk on governance. And I talked about it as, where did this come from? Well, partially this was like a trend in the field of public policy of when we see delivery of services, we see this emergence of non-government actors and public-private partnerships and new public management across sectors. This isn't something that's unique to housing. It is constant across almost all areas of government. When we look at US systems, we see what we would call polycentricity, multiple overlapping jurisdictions. So the way I think about this is, any city you go there, you're going to have like your local community groups, you're going to have your municipal government, your county government, your state government, probably some special districts. And for any given issue, there might be multiple governments who can actually affect outcomes in those areas. Part of what this means is, if we're going to think about outcomes of governance systems, we have to think about not only like traditional hierarchical networks, which is what you might learn about, in like your American government traditional hierarchies, like you might learn about in like an American government 101 class, but we actually need to think about networks. So when we look at something like home energy retrofits, we need to think about how different actors are working together, connecting who they know and how they build communities that way. just for fun, I thought it would actually be fun to talk about the two different how governance applies in the two different spheres we've been talking about in our grant, which I think, we talk about well-being a bit and we talk about residential energy systems. And to me, governance actually works a little bit differently in those two realms. I think the well-being literature focuses more on the normative elements of governance, whereas the residential energy systems is much more the empirical, like who are the actors, what do we observe there? And I tried to map this out a little bit so I could show what I mean. So I don't expect people to understand this graph in 30 seconds, but I tried to think, all right, we have federal actors, state actors, and local actors who we know affect what happens in homes. And Paul actually talked about almost all of these things that I put into these boxes. So things like the weatherization assistance program, efficiency standards, different incentives we could use. One thing that, as a political scientist, one thing we'll study is like, well, how do these non-governmental actors then link onto those government type programs? So we would generally label those non-governmental actors something like an intermediary. And so something like any corporation or nonprofits or trade organizations that help or somehow implement these government programs, we would think about them as intermediaries. And the governance says that, hey, these actors matter. It's not just the governments. We need to think about those other actors in this system that are implementing, or as Paul said, in some ways, getting in the way of the actions government would like to do. So if a trade organization, for example, is pushing back against a regulation, like we would study that as part of governance. I actually think to me, there's this other literature on well-being that I wanted to mention exists because if you are a well-being scholar, we'd actually study governance as a component of well-being. So how do I talk about this really quickly? I figured most of you are probably familiar with understanding of public trust in government, that if we look across US history since the 1960s, we see this declining trust in governance. And we actually think that's important as political scientists because we think people trusting in their governance is actually good for their well-being. One of the things I often try and teach my students about this is, yeah, if you look at that top level graph on this slide, we see this declining trust in governance, but that's not necessarily true across all sectors or all branches of government. So if we look at trust in local government, it really hasn't changed that much. It's changed a little bit, but not the drastic declines we'd see at the federal level. If you are a well-being scholar, though, you might actually study this as a component of subjective well-being. So you might actually ask people, hey, do you trust your government? Or, hey, do you feel like you have efficacy in shaping governance outcomes? And you can actually incorporate that into a model of, hey, are people well? I know there's a few aspects where this is actually used by governments in assessing policy outputs. So the one I'm familiar with, for a while, I worked with the Puget Sound Partnership up in Washington State, and they had this Puget Sound's vital signs wheel, and I put a picture of it there. I zoomed in on it on this slide because they have this measure of quality of life. And here we actually see good governance as one of the things they measure is like, hey, are we accomplishing the outcomes we're supposed to accomplish? Do people trust their governance? To me, I actually see a lot of our project as trying to bridge these two communities. So we're trying to understand what the actors are, who they are, how they're influencing quality of life and well-being. I think what's tricky there is we could also put governance as the dependent variable in that case. Real quick, I wanted to talk briefly how I've been utilizing this and what I've been thinking about lately. So I've been trying to spend some time thinking about these intermediaries. So the groups in that circle, those non-government actors. So I've been taking Chris's interview data and our sample and coding who are intermediaries these groups are interacting with. So I've been looking at training organizations, essentially, what organizations are present in Pueblo. Last June, I know I presented a basic version of this to the QT's team that was hey, we could run a model, but what I've been trying, I'm not even going to talk about this because I don't want you to look at it, but what I've been trying to make myself do is think about this as a network. So what if we think about these training organizations as bringing different contractors and homes together? So this is a network map that I was building of hey, what contractors are part of different trade organizations in the Pueblo area? And then what I've been trying to do is actually add in houses. So this messy graph on the left actually has houses and saying, well, what if we put everybody on an even playing field and say, we're going to put houses and contractors and training organizations in a network. And what we actually start to see is these communities emerge of, Paul talked about weatherization assistance programs. And if you look at the blue bars there on the left, so those are groups with BPI certifications, if you see that where we have weatherization contractors who often have people with BPI certifications working there, we see them serving very different populations than we see these other organizations. And so one of the things that tells us is, well, if we just understand people acting like, hierarchically, it's not necessarily going to help us, because we actually see different homes going to different contractors, and based on what contractors they're going to, they're going to fall under a different governance regime. Maybe, you're going to be under the weatherization assistance program, and people are going to check and make sure that your home's meeting the efficiency standards the program wants, which is very different than if you are completely working in the private realm. So that's how I've been trying to think about it. I'm going to stop talking as well, but yeah.
All right. The floor is open for questions, I think, and everybody recognize that each person on the team is coming from a different perspective, probably going to try to pervert your findings into a different way of expressing what change looks like or what its outcomes are. And everyone has different tools. But I think this was super useful. So, questions?
I have a question. May I start?
Of course.
Yeah, thanks both for those very thought-provoking comments. I'm just trying to think of this access problem that Paul first framed. And, Ryan is trying to think about how people have networks and there's not necessarily hierarchy. And I'm just curious about how one really creates and maps a network for any person or neighborhood. I'm just thinking about how people access these various agents and, who initiates the interaction if there is one, and how do you determine what a network is? I don't think you're suggesting it's spatial, Ryan. If I'm thinking about how I find out about, I want to install something, and I do a bunch of Google searches and I get some phone numbers of people in my state and I make phone calls. It just seems, I'm not sure how to map out the network of contacts for any particular household. It seems really difficult and almost ad hoc, depending upon what situation the household finds itself in. They need to upgrade an equipment, get a permit, or they never have to deal with the government unless someone comes to them offering incentives for a program. It just seems, so I'm just wondering, how does one really figure out people's networks of these agents and their interactions?
Paul, do you want to go first on the access, or do you want me to jump in how I've been thinking about it? I don't know.
Why don't you go first in terms of how you kind of map these things out, at least, because I think that's definitely more in your area. Whatever you want to say, and I'll chime in
Yeah,
after.
this is part of where like I'm excited about this project, because Chris is actually talking with people about this. And so like we should have some qualitative data on how people are approaching this. At this point, I've actually been somewhat I've been using housing characteristics and saying, if we look at housing characteristics and we see houses that have like generally, so we have people's names of homeowners, so we can like impute demographic characteristics and gender characteristics and things like that. And then we know the characteristics of their home, and home characteristics should generally correlate with income characteristics. And then I've been binning homes together. And that's not perfect in any sense of the word, but I've essentially been saying, if you live in a 1,600 square foot house, and we think there's a 60% chance you're Hispanic, and we think you're a woman and you have air conditioning in your house, all of those houses, we're going to treat them as the same. And then we're going to look at people who live in those sorts of houses. Who did they talk to? So what contractors did they actually file a permit with? I don't think that's perfect, but I actually think it's similar to the way people approach technology when they look at homes. So they'll bin homes together and say, oh, we see if we look at these types of homes, if they all install heat pumps, they'll have this sort of benefit. And so I was somewhat borrowing from that model and saying, how could we use this to understand the social system as well?
I want to follow or maybe add to Narasima's question. And Paul, maybe you can answer just his or mine or whatever. But I I think that we see what has happened from the type of thing that Ryan's doing. And so we know, so I get fuzzy on definitions of access, right? Like, I think a lot of people define access as it actually happened for you. But what I don't know is how to tell whether people could have access and decided not to do something. Like maybe you did have an electric charger and you just decided not to have a car. We're getting into Christina's territory here, so she probably has better ideas than on that. But with regard to housing, I feel like all you ever see is the outcomes that Ryan shared. And so you show what networks existed, but not what networks could have existed but were rejected. And so that's where I'm getting maybe into a little bit of Narsim's question, like how do you start? How do you know how this goes? And Paul, I don't know if you have insights from all of your engagement with people getting their homes weatherized on like differences in access and whether there's something that could be known, not just from the outcomes, but also from people's experience, contractors' experience, or programs' experience.
And so, I mean, to me, access is definitely not, did it happen for you? Access is, was it in the landscape of plausible, viable, real options for you? You decide whether you're going to do it. And simply having a program that's nominally going to install 4,000 heat pumps does not mean that those heat pumps are accessible to people. They might only be accessible to other people. And so you end up having, picking your winners and your losers and that sort of thing by who you make them accessible to and how you make them accessible. So, like some of the things that I have seen as being really important is they're really, I think I'm going to talk about two different types of things I think really help to improve access. One is having the residents, I mean, there's hundreds of millions of residents out there, right? We got like 140 million households in the country. And you're really not going to be able to do something with each one of them directly. So how do you access them kind of in bulk in a real way? And typically what my observation is, and this is not my area of science, but just my observation from being in these spaces, in these programs for a long time now, is that the more you have trusted people from the communities, the better access you're going to be providing to people, because for a number of reasons. One, if they see people from their communities as the people who are delivering the services, they're more likely to trust them because they feel like they've got some common ground. Also, those people who are delivering those services understand those communities, understand how to talk to those communities. They're not coming in with their whatever way of saying things that works for that other community, but does not speak to the issues of this community. And then also going through trusted leaders, going through like church leaders, going through trusted mayors. And Ryan showed that the trust in local governments is much higher than federal governments. And so, there are certainly in a lot of communities, they do trust their village mayor or whatever. And so they have, if you can work through them to get the information out, it's more likely to be taken seriously and become plausible, practical access, not just theoretical access because somebody said we have a program. The other thing I wanted to say is that it's also, I find, to be very important to have these larger successes if these community leaders are engaged up front while the decisions are being made. Rather, if you do that, then you have the opportunity to adjust how you're thinking and be able to say, hey, if we really want this program to serve this community, this is the sort of thing we're going to need to do to get into that community. These are the sorts of concerns the community is going to have. These are the things we're going to have to address. This is how we're going to need to work to get in, versus, hey, we've got this program that we think is going to be great for you, and we've got these people from outside your community who are going to come in and help you. That doesn't tend to go as well. And so, like in Chicago, I've certainly seen some really successful efforts where people who understand the communities work with the communities to really open up access to technologies and opportunities in the energy space that typically they're the last to get, and instead they're getting it much earlier because of this upfront engagement and having people from those communities be part of the process beginning to end. And I'm pleased to see Ryan nodding a lot, because I think that means he is agreeing with what I'm saying.
That's, I think, yeah, 100%. And like, I think when like, so it's really hard to observe that at like an individual level. And so like part of what I try and do is think, how can we observe that at an institutional level? So like one of the things looking at the Pueblo data, I got a little bit concerned about as I went through and I coded like what contractors had these advanced trainings. And when you look at Denver versus Pueblo, they're really different. There's just not a lot of contractors in Pueblo who have these advanced certifications. Excel is the provider in Denver, and they provide more incentives to get training done, and they have more requirements. Like if you want to use our rebate, you need this training. And so like if you look at the count of potential people they can work with in Denver, it's a lot bigger. And so like, because what Paul said, like that's concerning, because we know people want to work with people in their community. If you live in Pueblo, you're probably not going to call a contractor in Denver. You're going to call Arbuck, who fixes Chris's furnace. And so like even if we can't observe that at an individual level, my view is we can take institutional level data and look at governance structures and begin to build a picture of that, because it's just so hard to model it for an individual household.
Ryan, can you say more about that? Like, how do you find out from institutions, business of, to who are people accessing? Like, you have this hypothesis that you're bidding groups based on income, whatever, demography. Is that data that you can access on, like at an institutional level, who's accessing who? So you can verify this hypothesis about your bins?
Well, we know what contractors individual homes work with.
Okay.
We know we can look up like for individual contractors, you can identify like what certifications they have. Some certification agencies publish a list. Other, you have to go contractor by contractor. Like I emailed Nate, who's like one of the training firms, like, do you guys have a list of people you've given training to? And they're like, absolutely not. We don't keep that. But then other ones do. So like you can go look up the BPI certifications and it will tell you Paul Francisco is certified by the Building Performance Institute. And so it's partially like putting together what that looks like. Where I've really struggled is like things like Excel rebates. There's no way of tracing those unless you're Excel. They're the only people who know who got those rebates. Same with like county level rebates. Weatherization assistance type things, you can find out who the weatherization crews are. What's really tough there is when the crews are at capacity, sometimes they'll actually use private contractors. So I emailed the state weatherization agency and I was like, hey, do you guys have a list of private contractors? And they're like, oh, we don't keep that data. And so that exists, I guess, within like the individual, like the lower providers of, weatherization assistance. And so like it's imperfect at the institutional level, but I don't know, all data is imperfect. So I don't know if that was an answer to your question so much as this is how I've been going about thinking about it of, yeah, you have to code that. So
Oh, it totally was. And this is basically through permitting that you have that information that you know. Yeah. So this would be the case everywhere then, if you were to dig.
yeah.
Radul, what do you have?
Yeah, thanks, Paul and Rand, for the wonderful presentation. Rand, do you mind if I get a bit more technical with my questions?
Oh yeah, but I don't promise to have an answer. So
Yeah, that's fine. So I'm really interested in this network categorization. So first I was thinking that is there any way to have that mapping on more disaggregated level, individual mapping? But as I have mentioned, that it's very hard to get that information on household level information. But are these network characterization can at least be tied like spatial heterogeneity, like block level or something like more granular rather than for the whole CSU Pueblo or that kind of community?
Yeah, I think we could do that. I didn't put any spatial information in for now. As I didn't really have a strong reason to. I was like, as I've been thinking about this, I've been trying to think about like what are the key variables the literature said should matter. So like, what is your race, ethnicity? Like, what are your economic conditions? What are your home conditions? We could do it at the block level because we have people's addresses. I just haven't done that.
Yeah,
It would be a lot messier network.
yeah. I understand. I can totally work you on that. My idea is to have some block level categorization, which I can tie to the APM model, that how much active each of those blocks are in terms of this institutional activity. That would give us some understanding how much exposure people have in terms of decision-making process because of this organizational efficacy or
We
yeah.
might, I mean, it's something that I could be a little tempted to wait till we have outputs from Chris's interviews because Chris has been actually sampling people within blocks.
Mhm.
And so if Chris finds that matter, like there's neighborhood effects at all, then I think like that would give us a good justification to look at it.
Yeah.
But
And
I'd be a little tempted to wait on that so we have something to go on.
it's
Yeah,
fine. It's totally, I totally understand it's complex, but I feel that it's a really important thing to look at from a network perspective. And I have another question if is that okay, Tammy?
yeah, I
So
want to follow up on this one. So is that all right before you go to your next one?
sure, sure.
So Ray Dilla mentioned the possibility of spatial differences. I'm wondering, before we start that, Ryan and Paul, what do you think are the major geographical differences? Or whether it's geographical or not, what is it that creates differences among access? Is it whether they have a good contractor in their area, like you don't care where they are in Pueblo, or because you don't usually go to just the person next door? Or is it the local government, or is it who retains a list, or what are the issues or differences in behavior of different types of institutions that create differences among people and what they can access?
I'm really curious how Paul's going to answer this question because like I've been so the data in Pueblo is super weird. It essentially looks like people with worse housing conditions are accessing better contractors. And I think it's like essentially all driven by the weatherization assistance program of like government has a role here. And like we often think about like, oh, what are homeowners doing? And like it's I think a lesson that like rules matter. And there are rules about what weatherization program has to do, that there's rules about what no other contractor has to face. And I think it really matters. I'm suspicious that like there's like something I'm missing there. And yeah, so that's why I want to know what Paul has to say. Because like no matter what I do, it just seems like low income people are accessing better contractors. So
And I think at some level that is true because of what you just said, the weatherization program, because there are really substantial training requirements and quality control inspections done on every home. So if mistakes are identified, the contractor has to come back out and fix it. You don't see that in almost any other place with that level of quality assurance on the front end, quality control on the back end, which does lead to better outcomes and better trained contractors to do better work. I certainly think that people are going to, as I was suggesting before, they're first going to look for folks who are from their communities, nearby, that understand their communities, that they feel comfortable with because they are similar. One of the things I think is a real challenge, and I was just thinking about this before Tammy asked this, and so I'm glad I have the opportunity to bring this forward. I think a lot of institutions, a lot of organizations, utilities, et cetera, they have a habit of they keep going back to the people they've worked with before.
Mhm.
We've worked with these contractors for the last 30 years. And so they just keep contracting with the same people that they've been working with for 30 years, which kind of reinforces the exclusivity of that group of approved contractors. And so it makes it more difficult for new contractors who might be coming from those communities. You know, we're trying to do training for people from disadvantaged communities, but then they have to have jobs. They have to be able to set up their own businesses and have the opportunity to get enough work to stay in business. But then if the utility, for example, just keeps going with the same folks that it worked with for the last 30 years, that keeps those people out, keeps those people down, and you don't get that change. And so I think one of the things that we're starting to recognize is when it's time for contracting for a program to bring in approved contractors, looking at how we set up those rules for expanding access, not by residents, but by businesses, new businesses, new contractors from those communities to be able to participate in the program. How do we do that? Or are we just reinforcing the status quo? And there's a question in here, weatherization programs. It varies. Weatherization, there is weatherization in every county in the United States. How it's done, it varies all over the place. For example, in Illinois, there are about 30 weatherization agencies. Some of them serve one county. Some of them serve up to 9 counties. Some of them are local governments, like the city of Rockford does the county that Rockford is in. St. Clair County does the county that East St. Louis is in. That's St. Clair County. Then you've got community action agencies that are not government entities running programs for perhaps several counties. Then on the other hand, you've got in Colorado, there's like 6 agencies for the whole state as opposed to the 30-ish in Illinois. And they tend, on the western slope, the northwest part, it is also a governmental agency. Energy Resource Colorado has multiple offices, multiple branches that do pretty much most of the work on the eastern side of the mountains. So it's highly variable, very heterogeneous in how that is done.
So I think one of the challenges, and certainly not going to sort that out in the last 15 minutes of the call or 10 minutes, if we end up before the hour. But I think one of the challenges we face as a team is our goal is to produce some models, by which I mean showing how quickly houses could transition in different measures. And we know it's not as simple as the models that are currently out there, which is often people make a decision based on cost, and if it's cost effective, and and maybe they care about the environment, so you might have 2 things, then the better or more environmentally friendly option will be adopted. So that's the current state of modeling, and we know it's super complicated and not that easy. What is the next thing? Like we can't, when I hear something that's really complicated, like the state has, sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's different programs, it seems intimidating, and maybe it's not as intimidating as I'm making it. But what are a few things that we should pay attention to in order to have some more realism in what we perceive as possible? And so that's to you, Paul, but also to Ryan. Ryan, you had a really nice little figure of all the things that could affect the decisions. Some of those are long-term, right? Like the codes and standards pushing back is probably on the order of years, right? And some of them are short-term. And so which of those are the most important connections to begin to pay attention to? Because I think our goal is to say something like, what you said, Paul, well, if you have people who are in the communities, but this group does not have people in the communities, or this state does not do it that way, then it goes slower or less effectively. But we want to do that in a supportable way. Not that what you said was not supportable, but more, right, this has been the evidence, and that is why we looked at these particular things to demonstrate their effectiveness. So it's just a thought about, like, it's probably, we're always going to be oversimplifying, but we want to be less oversimplifying than in the last round, maybe.
Yeah, so I think some of the things really want to look at is, what are the residents being asked to do? Like, are they being asked to pay a lot, or are they not? So, what is the expectation of the resident? What are the rules of whatever is being done? And one of the things, people in the, what they call market rate, so that's not programs, that's, you're out there, you're a contractor selling energy efficiency. Market rate folks have always wanted to see us not have to have programs anymore. And the reality is that's not how it works. They've been waiting for 30 years for us not to need these programs in order to have a lot of work done in this area. So it continues to be driven by programs. And so then if it's driven by programs, then what are the program rules? What are the program's rules about eligibility? What are the program rules about how often you can come back? Like in weatherization, once you've been served, you can't get served again for 15 years. Then it doesn't matter what else has happened in terms of technology or what happened to your house, you're done. What are the rules in terms of training? I call it the BPI certifications. What are the rules in terms of quality control? What are the rules in terms of eligible measures? Like in weatherization, they use the savings to investment ratio. How many times over the lifespan of the measure is it expected to pay for itself? Utility programs use typically TRM or TRC, total resource cost. So there's cost effectiveness rules that makes certain things eligible or not. And a lot of times having those requirements and what you're allowed to count and what you're not dictate what sorts of technologies can get put in. So I think really understanding the limitations placed on people by programs that are the primary mechanism for getting these things in. And where are people getting hired from? Into contractors, into weatherization agencies. Where are they coming from? Those are just a couple of thoughts that I have in terms of the sorts of things to be looking at that are not necessarily what we would love to have be the case.
Wow. I'm glad you had an answer. I don't know if I have an answer to that question. I mean, I keep not wanting to look at contractors because we were supposed to wait to look at contractors. And every time I try to not look at contractors, I end up looking at contractors again because I think they matter a lot. And I think their training matters a lot and how people are finding them. Like, I think a lot of people are just finding them by looking at their furnace, to Paul's point, and seeing whose sticker is on their furnace. And that's not just a government thing. It's like, and individuals do that as well. At the same time, like we haven't talked about like loans and lending and any of that, and I'm curious what impact that could potentially have in this system. I don't know. I mean, I think traditionally in like the urban planning literature, that's where people have looked, is like government lending policies lead to single family homes, and that created energy inefficient cities. But I think like there's probably more stories there that have to do with retrofits as well, of who is able to access financing to improve their house. What is the role of government programs there? Or if you have to go to a private loan, how does that shape what happens? I don't have a way of getting at that, but I think it's a missing piece that we haven't talked about.
Yeah, I know that there's a lot of like in economics, there's a lot of thought that, hey, if energy efficiency is such a great thing, if it's going to have all these great paybacks, then why isn't everybody doing it? And I think that ignores that people aren't just saying, what's the most cost effective thing for me right now over some period of time. They're trying to, how do I have dinner tonight? How do I have medicines for the next week? Can I even heat my house? Yeah, I'm not worried about getting a more efficient system. I'm worried about having a system that even works and trying to stay warm. So, I think that ignores the realities that a lot of people face in terms of all of life's pressures that make it so that, hey, yeah, it could be a fantastic idea. It could be over a 10-year payback period, the best thing you could possibly do, but that doesn't help get to next Tuesday.
I also
Chris-
think like, oh, sorry, go for
I wanted to give Chris a chance because he's the person who's actually talking to people. And so just wanted to know if there's anything you wanted to bring up or ask based on your interviews, Chris.
No, I mean, I certainly have asked questions about, how they go about selecting who they do to do the work they're doing. And so far it's, been somewhat of a mix. Some responses have pointed to, old-fashioned or new-fashioned Google reviews, I guess. Others have talked to neighbors. Others have, more or less went with 3 or 4 different options to get multiple quotes, and they did a bit more legwork that way. So it's been a mix there. I haven't talked to anybody yet who has made use of governmental programs. That might come though a little bit later once we start connecting more with the health department. Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head to add to that, but if there is anything, if there is anything else I can answer now, I will. Otherwise, next week I'll try to package that all together a little bit better.
Yeah, thanks.
One thing I keep thinking about too, and this is relevant to Chris's interviews as well, is like when we first were working on this grant and we talked with the public health people in Pueblo, they were like, well, we could work on energy efficiency, but like what we're really struggling with is, lead paint and how do we remediate lead in our community? And like that's something that's stuck with me because like if I'm a homeowner and like I have to deal with an issue, like I might, and I know I have a lead issue, I think like that's going to dramatically influence what I choose to do. And so like I think housing conditions still matter. And like, I don't know, we didn't talk about it today, but I want to bring it up again because I think it's something I always have in the back of my mind. If you live in low quality housing, like you have a lot of potential issues to deal with. It's not just your furnace or your insulation. So.
That's a really, really good point, Ryan, that the people tend to respond, I think, a lot more to the health of their families than they do to the size of their energy bills. So, and when they have, if somebody has $2,000 to spend and they can choose between energy efficiency, having their car run, and something about the health of their families, which is going to be the last one they would choose? I'm guessing it'd be energy efficiency because they only have so much money and the other 2 things are more important to them.
All right, well, I'm gonna close the meeting. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you'd be willing to maybe come back and comment on our very poor efforts to encapsulate some of the things that people experience and help them, and don't help them. And just let us know if we know we're missing big things. And so maybe the question will be something like, are we missing fewer big things now? And yeah, so I hope you'd be willing to comment when we're able, if and when we're able to come up with something. Thanks so much for joining.
Yep,
Thanks, everyone.
thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, bye.
Thanks, Stacy.